maybe it was October. It was the Black reunion, I
Oh,
think. Or
yes,
maybe
right.
that was
Yes.
part of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you, everyone, for joining. We'll just take a few seconds to let people get logged on. There's a large and lively crowd for Dr. Hooker's book, and I think for good reason. So we just want to make sure people have had an occasion to log on and get settled, and we'll get started in just a few minutes. But thank you, Juliet, for doing this. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
For the audience, they often just listen to me talk to our guests. So we were just chatting about the last time we saw each other, which was at a great event at Brown University, where Juliet is a professor and I'm an alum. But it was either for the Black reunion or maybe it was before that. I get dragged up there so many times. I shouldn't say dragged. I enjoy going back, but I'm often up there.
Yeah, I think it was a book launch or a book event for the ex-president Ruth Simmons and her memoir that just got published
That's
recently.
Right. Yeah, for those who don't know, Ruth Simmons was the first Black woman to lead, first Black person to lead an Ivy League institution at all, and obviously a Black woman, but she released her memoir, which takes her, I haven't read it yet, but I think it takes her up to the presidency of Brown, or maybe up to being president of Smith, which was where she was before Brown University, but not actually the Brown University part, which she said, jokingly, I think was too scandalous to write about. Lizzie, how we doing on attendance? Are folks in the stream? Okay. All right. Well, let's get started then, because there's a lot of rich material to cover here. Good afternoon, all. Thank you for joining today's event. My name is Rakim Brooks, and I am the president of the Alliance for Justice. We are an association of more than 150 organizations committed to building power, transforming courts, and securing justice for all. Today's conversation is part of our ongoing Holding Court series, Justice Conversations with AFJ, where we feature leading activists, scholars, and attorneys to discuss political and social justice issues. In honor of Black History Month, I'm grateful to have Professor Juliet Hooker with me today on Holding Court to discuss her recent book, Black Grief, White Grievance, The Politics of Loss. If you haven't ordered it yet, I really suggest you go ahead and grab a copy. It's very rich. But before we get to the substance of that discussion, let me just tell you a little bit about Professor Hooker. Professor Hooker is the Royce Family Professor of Teaching Excellence in Political Science at Brown University and an author of several books. And by several, I don't just mean like 2 or 3. It's like a lot going on over in Professor Hooker's world. She is a political theorist specializing in racial justice, Black political thought, Latin American political thought, democratic theory, and contemporary political theory. So, Professor Hooker, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Well, let me get started somewhat towards the middle of the book, maybe the first half of the book, in a chapter whose name I just loved, which was Whither White Refusal, where you say the greatest threat to U.S. democracy today is not Black radicalism, but white grievance. Indeed, if anything, it is Black citizens who continue to bear the brunt of democratic sacrifice. The sacrifices expected of Black citizens and activists for the sake of white democracy are part of a long-standing historical pattern. That's grabbing from another part of the book. But I thought that encapsulated what the sort of mode of the book is and what it is you're trying to do. So I wondered if you could just explain to us what you mean by the greatest threat is white grievance, not Black radicalism.
Yes, of course. So I think, we're often have this image that's trotted out, right? That Black protesters are a threat. They're angry. Black radicals, are pushing the country too far, too fast. They don't really, protest in the right way. And actually, one of the things that I wanted us to recognize is that actually, despite having suffered horrendous racist violence, from lynching to Jim Crow segregation, ongoing systematic discrimination, Black people have been remarkably peaceful. They have been remarkably good citizens of a democracy that has not lived up to its promises to them. And that, in fact, it has often been, white citizens who have felt aggrieved and resented the idea that they were being displaced from their rightful place at the center of U.S. politics, or who felt like, they had to hold back the tide of, let's say, racial justice or other kind of social transformation, who have actually wielded political violence and who have refused to uphold the terms of U.S. democracy if it meant that their preferences didn't win the day. And so part of what I was trying to say is that we're in a moment now, as we have been in the past, where what we see is that it is, in fact, folks often, right, radicalize white citizens who are willing to dispense with democracy, who are willing to engage in political violence, and who therefore are a real threat to U.S. democracy in this moment.
And one of the things I think you're trying to excavate in the book is why exactly white citizens seem so unwilling to suffer loss in our politics. And you used a term which I've seen other places, but for some reason it's just so much more resonant in your book, Herrenvolk democracy, which is sort of white democracy, the recognition that the founding the foundation of the country is really not committed to equal racial justice under law, as we sometimes sort of trot out, but rather really has held Black citizens and citizens of color in general in a subordinate position, which makes it difficult for white citizens to experience loss and share in loss. So I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about how you describe the sacrifice is supposed to be equally distributed in democracies, but it's not.
Absolutely, right. So democracy, above perhaps most political systems, is about loss. We often think about democracy as being about empowerment, right? We go out there, we organize with other people, we mobilize, and we're able to enact our preferred policies. But if we win, right, if our policy prevails, that means that somebody else's policy vision lost. And so part of what I think we don't recognize as much is that democracy is just as much about losing, right? About being able to accept loss when it's legitimate, and peacefully accept loss, and then, find ways to move forward, either to fight the next battle or to accept that you lost this round and you come back and try again. And I think, because they have precisely not had political power, they were excluded from political participation for so long, right? We didn't even get the Voting Rights Act until the 1960s, and we still see so many barriers to African Americans and other citizens of color, whether it's gerrymandering, voter ID laws, lack of, voting precincts, and other barriers to having equal representation, that I think, it's been the case that these communities have had to deal with loss. They've had to find ways to still believe in U.S. democracy, to still work for it, even if they haven't reaped the same benefits. And I think one of the things that that hasn't been the case as much is because whites as a group, right, have been the dominant group, they have been able to exercise political power, that they aren't accustomed to losing. And so when they do, or when there are advances for other groups, they often see that as, as a loss for them, right? A win for another group is a loss for me, or a displacement of my rightful place. And so this idea that, we need to think about losing not as a pejorative, but as something that is actually central to being a good democratic citizen. Losing well when it is a legitimate loss is a core idea of the book.
Well, of course, we're suffering right now with the unwillingness to have lost fairly, as now candidate Trump, but former President Trump and his followers believe that the 2020 election was stolen. I know that you've been working on this book for quite a long time, going back to the protests of Ferguson. But as you were writing it, I suspect you found material that further advanced and supported your thesis. And so could you just tell us a little bit about, as you were going through the writing process, unfortunately, how the events of January 6th might have informed some of the arguments that are found in the book?
Yes, absolutely. So as you noted, I started writing after Ferguson, right? And I was trying to make sense of the kind of militarized police response to the protesters there, the critique of the protesters, and the ways in which that community trying to express their grief and anger was really difficult for it to be understood by many observers from the outside. And then the 2016 presidential campaign happened, and of course we have this campaign that was marked by misogyny, by xenophobia, all of the things that we know, these very exclusionary discourse. And so I started to think about how we needed to think about Black grief and white grievance simultaneously, right? That these were two responses to loss, to the perception of loss, to real loss, and that were mobilizing people politically. And of course, books take years to write, or maybe other people write them faster. I don't know. They take me a long time. And as I was actually getting towards the end of the book, then we had the racial justice protests of 2020 after the killing of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. And I had to think about how to incorporate that into the book. And then, of course, immediately after, we had January 6th and the insurrection, the refusal to accept loss. So, one of the interesting things was that these events actually seemed to reinforce that the arguments I was making or explaining what was happening. But it was a challenge to try to think about how to integrate them. And I think one of the things that January 6th in particular was useful for was for illustrating that often when we think about what's motivating people in terms of in white grievance, we think about it as being economic precarity, right? That it's the white working class that is being materially displaced. So one of the things that was interesting and very, noteworthy about January 6th was who the insurrectionists were, how they, cut across class lines. It was often well-to-do people. It wasn't like your typical, radicalized, person who engages in some form of political violence. And so that I think was very important for me to incorporate into the book, thinking about why do these people feel like they're being displaced, that there's a loss that needs to be avenged, and how do we make sense of that, especially because we know that, in fact, the elections weren't stolen. So how do we think about, folks who are mobilized essentially by a lie?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that your book left me asking towards the end was, how do we learn how to lose? I mean, part of what you're pointing out is that the experience of Black Americans in the country, by virtue of their disenfranchisement for so many years and continued restrictions on voting and so forth, create an experience of loss. And then the sort of regularized experience of Black death creates an experience of loss.
Mm-hmm.
And there are some references that suggest, we all experience loss in life, regardless of our racial identity. But you're talking about a particular kind of political loss. And I wondered if you've developed thoughts. There are sort of gestures that white citizens need to learn how to lose. But what is the teacher in this process? What does that education look like?
Well, that's a $1 million question, right? So I just wanted to say one thing about to clarify. I think that loss is a universal human experience, right? We all experience it in different parts of our lives. But in terms of political loss, which has to do, of course, electoral loss is the clearest example of that, but is also there are also losses that are the result of state action or inaction or or issues around which people mobilize politically. Then in terms of political loss, I mean, I think there's a couple things I would say in response to your question. One is that it's important to recognize that while Black people have learned to live with loss, that we don't make this into a kind of form of civic excellence, right? Because that runs the risk of saying you should always be sacrificing, right? You should always be accepting loss, as opposed to recognizing that no, having to do that, having this unequal distribution is precisely the problem, right? And I think one of the things that, in terms of thinking about how white citizens who, respond to perceptions of loss or to real loss with, with resentment or backlash, one thing that we can begin to think about is how do we move beyond zero sum thinking, right? So one of the features of white grievance that I talk about in the book is this zero sum thinking, where a win by another group or a gain by another group is interpreted as a loss for your group, right? So it can't be that, okay, maybe one example of this is gay marriage. There were people who, for example, were very upset about gay marriage, who were straight, who felt like somehow that diminishes the status of their unions because it was now being extended to gay couples. That's an example of not being able to simply say, hey, a win, or a gain for them does not take anything away from me. And so I think trying to move beyond this kind of zero sum way of thinking about loss is a step in the right direction. I think the other thing is, learning to accept, to really engage with the history of the United States in a really accurate way. I think often, I think folks who resort to white grievance have these narratives of sort of white racial innocence that they tell themselves about these eras when there wasn't as much racial conflict, or where there wasn't any kind of threat of social change. And the reality is that has been a feature of the country since its inception.
Yeah, one of the things you were just reminded me of a piece in the book where I should have written down the quote, but I think it's Du Bois in Dark Water, where he's quoting someone who says, the Negroes just seem so angry these days, and it's so hard to find good help, as though the outrage or anger that people feel at the system at that particular moment manifesting itself somehow has eroded the kind of civic bond that previously existed, and therefore is destructive. One of the things I wanted to draw out, just because you are a political theorist, and I thought, just like we were talking about white democracy here and folk democracy, you raised something in the book that I thought was super important, at least from my view and maybe for our audience. We often have gotten into the habit now as progressives of talking about oligarchy, of referring to the notion of there being powerful elites who are manipulating the system, controlling the system. And you sort of take that kind of elite frame of an oligarch and actually apply it to race and to the masses. And you point out the fact that one of the things that Aristotle teaches us is that oligarchs, or members of any dominant social class, as you put it, do not learn how to lose, and in fact are committed to staving off loss. And that Aristotle is clear that the oligarchic commitment to political mastery is about preventing material loss and hoarding social standing. Now, that was all relevant for me in our work because we just had the affirmative action decision, of course, relevant to your actual experience on a college campus. And it struck me that if whiteness is a kind of oligarchy in our society, and there therefore is built into it a refusal to lose, a refusal to, and a desire to stave off loss, that maybe that's what we were seeing at play in the affirmative action decisions, right? That the conversations that were being had about what diversity really means, as you put it, was all about zero sum gain and loss. How did you receive the affirmative action decision? Because again, that came sort of on the, probably before the publication of the book, but on the heels of your having completed it.
Yeah, no. So I think that is the affirmative action decision. I think is a good example of one of the ways in which we might think about how, um, you know, how refusal to loss is shaping contemporary racial politics in the U.S. And I think we often think about white grievance or white refusal, right, to accept loss in terms of let's say, January 6th, or we think about something like Unite the Right rally in Charleston, right? These sort of violent expressions of anger directed at various groups of people of color, or at perceived coalitions that support multiracial coalitions that support Democratic candidates. But in fact, I think there are other forms of refusal that have to do with and that go across the political spectrum, that have to do with unwillingness, right, to cede advantages that are the result of the fact that the country was built on the basis of white supremacy. And so there have been greater economic and educational opportunities historically in the United States for whites than, let's say, African Americans. And so I think the affirmative action decision for me is an example of this, this enormous, I think, anxiety, right, around who is in our elite institutions, right? This is focused on often Ivy League institutions, and it's about the greater, by no means far-reaching, but greater diversity on those campuses. And at the same time, it's also, I think, about anxiety about, what's going to happen to my kids, right? Are my kids going to be able to get into these schools that I want them to? So these are examples, I think, of essentially wanting to hold on to material advantages that were not earned, right? Were the result of unjust ways of distributing goods. And yet, folks don't want, or are often unwilling to say, hey, there's been these historical exclusions. These are ways to try to, make these institutions more, more available to a wider group of people in the country, make them more representative. And I think that's perceived as a threat. And I think, if you look at the research, right, that economists and others have done, you see across the board that, there are all of these enormous disparities that educational opportunities, further entrench, right? Things like where you go to college, and that, higher education can serve as a way to, it's not the only way and it's not enough, but it can serve as a way to try to, to address some of those inequalities that are not, so a kid doesn't decide where they're born or what community they're born into and what are the historical abilities of that community or that family to amass wealth, or, all of the, or to, have access to income, et cetera. And so I think that when we look at the affirmative action decision, I think what we see is something that MLK talked about, in the 1960s. And he said, we are going to lose white liberal allies as the struggle requires greater sacrifices. He says in Where Do We Go From Here? He says, up to now, what they have been asked to give up has been, he says, largely symbolic. When we have to move to the plane of giving up sort of material advantages, he's very clear that people are going to fall along the way because they're unwilling to do that.
Yeah. Well, obviously that's the case in a lot of our current jurisprudence. That's what the Alliance for Justice mostly primarily focuses on our constitutional democracy, focusing on who sits on our courts and how they interpret, and then our civic society through other nonprofits. If I could take that and draw it into conversation with something else that you wrote about, it struck me. I almost wanted to, almost wanted a chapter. Maybe I'm giving you a new assignment. I wanted a chapter that was called something like Rodney King, January 6th, and disinformation. And the reason I raised that is because we often have this current conception that disinformation, misinformation are new, as in the ways in which lies are spread through society and gain widespread acceptance as a result of 2016 and the Russian intervention. And I used to joke with friends that I wanted to create a podcast, a show that was called Black Facts, which was just going to be about things that Black people seem to know that other people don't seem to know. And what that was about. And I really thought you encapsulated, you gave me the best example I've ever had for this, which is you quoted from a juror during the Rodney King trial. That is the trial of the officers who assaulted Rodney King. And this is the quote. I want everybody to just take this in for a minute. Later, a juror reported that she believed that Rodney King was in total control of the situation. And I believe you're quoting Judith Butler or someone else, but you said, how was this feat of interpretation achieved? That it was achieved as not a consequence of ignoring the video. That is, this juror saw the same video everybody else saw, but rather of reproducing the video within a racially saturated field of visibility. Now, that's all academic talk, I think, for she saw it as a white person perceiving threat. And the conversation that the police officers had at that time, which was he possessed superhuman strength because he kept standing up, though they were striking him. And so what am I trying to draw a parallel between? It struck me that one of the conversations we're not really having in terms of thinking about misinformation and disinformation with regard to January 6th and how people are accepting the big lie, as they say, is that it's grounded in that racially saturated field of visibility. It is what they're able to see. It is actually a kind of truth to them. Am I making sense? Am I interpreting this correctly?
You are. And I think that this is a really important point, right? At another point in the book, I write about the fact that we often think that video evidence or visual evidence photographs in the case of lynching would have this, definitive effect in persuading people of the facts of an encounter, but that in fact people bring everything that they've been taught, everything that they've experienced to their reading of these moments. And so you have the people who see the videos of Black people killed by the police and say, oh, they shouldn't have resisted. Oh, they shouldn't have said that. They should have obeyed the commands. And of course, people are saying this now about the most recent videos. But, the example you're pointing to goes back, of course, to Rodney King. And of course, it goes back even further than that, where I think there is this, if you go back to slavery, for example, one of the myths that pro-slavery, advocates would trot out would be to say that there were enslaved people were happy, right? That they were, that when they sang, what Du Bois called the sorrow songs as they worked, that was a sign of their happiness. But of course, it wasn't a sign that they were happy. It was, Frederick Douglass then later talked about how whenever he heard those songs, even after he had long been free, that they would take him back to that place and had this enormous effect on him. And the reason for that was because they were, of course, telling the story, but they had to tell them in a way that passed white detection, right? So if you're an enslaved person, you can't come out and criticize your enslaver. So maybe you tell a song that on the surface says something, but that is really telling the story or allowing you to express your pain, your anger, your fear, whatever the emotion is. And I think, so this question of what experiences people bring to how they interpret these moments and these facts, right, about the racial life that we share, I think is really important. I think your point about misinformation is well taken. This is, we've been having this conversation for a very long time. Think about Confederate monuments and the story they're trying to tell about the Civil War, which goes totally against the experience of Black people, right? Who have a totally different memory of what the war was about and, what these symbols stand for. So I think the question of the big lies, the latest iteration, I think, of a set of lies that we have been telling ourselves about race in this country for a long time.
You've led me right where I wanted to go actually by talking about symbols, because that was, again, one of the more powerful and educational moments for me in the book, which was thinking about, you call it phantom possession, which I thought was a great phrase, but that part of white grievance is about, quote, the erosion of white priority, especially in the symbolic realm. And you were talking specifically about Confederate monuments. And I just wondered, in the 1619 Project and critical race theory being a sort of trope for talking about DEI education and so forth, could you just talk about the meaning of symbolism in a democracy and why it is the case that things that, to me and to, I'm sure, many people, just seem like, why are we fighting about that? I mean, even folks who would trivialize it, let me put it that way, right? So there are folks who are fighting about it and we're sort of like, they're bizarre. Why are they doing that? Confederate monuments, flags, at least on the progressive side. But then there are some of us who are actually quite dismissive of the cultural fights to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
But I think with the case you were trying to make was that's actually a crucial battleground actually to be fought. It's not something that you can just throw away. And part of it is because it feeds so much into certain people's notion of what the country is. But I just wanted to give you a chance to talk about that relationship between symbols in a society and democracy.
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. So one of the things that I talk about in the book is that while we can't distinguish them in practice because they're connected, conceptually, it's important to think about the difference between symbolic and material loss. And that's because if material loss, right, would be something like, okay, there are, in order to have, more equitable educational opportunities, you have to redistribute resources, in terms of, public schools, higher education, et cetera, et cetera. That, right, is material loss. Symbolic loss is more about, right, these what's often dismissed as the culture wars, right? And I think one thing that's really important is that as much as people are often talking about how the white working class is motivated by economic precarity, that if you look at what's been mobilizing people, what has been driving people to feel displaced, to express racial resentment, it's often these symbolic, these symbolic issues that don't really transform the material conditions. So one example is if we go back to that faraway time, it seems now, when Obama was elected, and the folks who felt that somehow having a Black person as president was this enormous change, and having a Black family was somehow, as the first family, was somehow really indicative of the fact that white people were now being oppressed somehow in the United States. I don't know if you remember, Fox News would run, stories about how Black kids were now being beaten up on school buses, or they would talk about King Obama, right? So there's this sense that these kind of symbolic changes that don't transform anything, right? Because it's not like Barack Obama governed as anything but a fairly centrist Democrat, that they somehow are experienced as dislocating, right? And so I think part of what I'm trying to say in the book is that because of that, we need to pay attention to symbolic loss and not simply dismiss it as something that doesn't matter or that is not as important as, let's say, material transformation, because it's mobilizing to people, and it's often, I think, been just as mobilizing, I think, particularly in terms of white grievance, as actually material loss.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. Makes a lot of sense to me. And I'm curious if you have thoughts or other parts of your research that maybe weren't in this book, or perhaps I missed it, about how we collectively create joint symbols, rather than thinking solely in terms of loss. What feels like something, is there something we've done as of late as a country, as a society, where, there's never 100% of buy-in to anything. But there ideas or examples that you have of what that kind of co-creation looks like? Because it strikes me that that's what democracy is supposed to be about. It's supposed to be the act of citizens coming together, co-creating. You're pointing out this important piece of, you don't always get to co-create, or at least sometimes you're co-creating and you lose, but there's the opportunity to come back and co-create. What examples might you have of spaces or work that we're producing that exemplifies that?
That is a very good question. I guess I don't know that I'm going to answer that question by restating it in a different way, which is
for sure. And this is so the audience knows she may have gotten some questions beforehand, but I'm always asking things on the run that are interesting to me. So by all means, please take it in a generous spirit. Take it wherever you'd like.
That one of the things that, this book and my work in general has been about race. And one of the things that I'm thinking about now is particularly monuments and how we remember the past, what kind of lessons about the future we're trying to tell. And I think there are a number of ways in which people are really thinking about this this question now. I mean, if you look at some of the initiatives by the Mellon Foundation or organizations like Monument Lab, like they're really trying to look at the sort of public landscape of the United States and say, who's represented in it? How do we make it more representative of what the actual body politic looks like? But I think for me, one of the things that we need to, or one of the questions that we need to bring to those discussions is like, what civic values do we want? What stories do we want to tell citizens about who we think they should be and what values they should embrace? And if you look at the vast number of Confederate monuments in this country compared to the scarcity of monuments that are remembering, for example, the Union and the people who fought for freedom, that what we don't have is actually a tradition deeply rooted, widely shared, of kind of, let's say, anti-racist commemoration. How do we foster, through our public symbols, commitments to anti-racism? And I think instead what we've had is a dominant public landscape that has done the opposite.
Absolutely. Well, let me say why I asked the question, because it struck me. I think that's exactly right, and the work that the Mellon Foundation is doing is tremendous. I asked the question because I think that part of the sensitivity to loss and erasure and displacement is partially about not knowing what it would look like to co-create. For instance, I mean, sometimes I've said, folks will say, well, what is, let me give a concrete example. When I was clerking I clerked on the Constitutional Court of South Africa. And some years after I'd left, I got a note from the justice for whom I clerked, over which there had been a very contentious case in the Con Court. There were two white justices of Afrikaner descent, and the rest being Black South Africans. And the case was about the removal of names from streets in a part of South Africa that had been historically led by the Afrikaners. And there was a great deal of kind of, not distrust, but anxiety, I think, among the white justices, both of whom, or at least one of whom, I don't know about the other one's history, but who had fought against apartheid, I mean, quite intensely, in saying, well, you're erasing a kind of history that isn't tinged by racism necessarily. And how is it that that piece of us is preserved? And they wrote dissents to that extent. I thought it was, sort of the right side of the argument, both arguing with one another about what that future would look like. And so that's kind of where the question is coming from, because one of the things that I remember one of the justices saying, or one of the Black justices saying in response, was like, we're committed to democracy. Like, we didn't create this system. Actually, we've actually just been fundamentally more committed to it than you have been. So that's our act of co-creation, right? We're all in it to say that everybody gets to vote. We didn't create a different system where only we got to vote, or we got more votes or something because of our historical disadvantage. And so anyway, this is just me trying to explore what it is that might look like for us.
I think that this is a really important question to think about, because I think when you look at, for example, I write about this in the book, that there was this move to put Harriet Tubman on the currency, and there was a certain amount of backlash against it. And of course, one response to that would be like, well, who cares who's on the on the face of the currency? And from many Black people, one of the responses was like, this is actually an affront to Harriet Tubman, that you are going to put her on currency when she wasn't able to own herself, and she did have to quote unquote commit a criminal act, steal herself in order to free, right? That there are all these very serious questions about what this would mean. And there are other people who thought, oh no, that's great, this is a great act of symbolic representation. But for the folks who were critical of it, from the other side, let's say, who didn't want it, it was because it seemed to point to the fact that you can't create a kind of workable or usable national narrative if you actually confront the injustices in your past. So I think this is really part of the issue, is that we don't know, or we haven't learned how to tell a complicated history about how the country was founded and developed. And instead we rely on these sanitized stories because they're sort of easier to swallow. And of course, for the people, right, for Native Americans, for African Americans, for people who have been excluded, those stories are not, false or incomplete. And so you have the competing narratives. And so I think part of the question is really, thinking about not being afraid of telling the complicated story, right? And figuring out how doing that actually helps us not make those same mistakes. I mean, I think, just in terms of monuments, right? This was also a debate around the Vietnam Memorial, right? And how do you remember these, these moments in the past that you can't cast in this kind of heroic, positive light all the time.
Yeah. You, as we were talking about that, you were making me think that there are parts of your book where you're talking about Aina Arendt's reflections on the Supreme Court's decision in Brown v. Board and the integration of Little Rock. But it was making me think currently about the Supreme Court's thoughts on gerrymandering and the re-entrenchment of political power, particularly as we saw it in Alabama, and now there's been a case in Louisiana. There'll be cases throughout the South on this question. But the court seems to really be struggling. I know you're not a legal scholar, but there's an angle to this that I think is reflected in your book. The court seems to really be struggling with this idea of loss. That actually, and I don't know that they even have the terminology in the way that you described it. They've kind of treated it just as a political problem rather than a fundamental democratic problem. So what does the court say? The court says, well, if you start engaging in racial gerrymandering, that is dividing Black citizens and white citizens, that's problematic from the perspective of the Constitution. But if you divide people by political party, effectively having the same outcome, so re-entrenching rule based on a majority white Republican Party, that's okay. And that's just politics. And part of the reason I wanted to bring this book to this audience, which is not used to hearing from us on these topics, was to draw those strands together to show that actually democracy, if it's about loss and it has these overlays of our history with racial oppression, that we ought to be looking to our court and our institutions to mitigate the losses that people have. And part of the burden of your book, and we haven't talked nearly enough about Black grief, is that, as you put it in one portion of it, for Black politics, the hope has been that making Black grief visible will undermine white grievance. But instead, that very visibility of Black loss can lead to escalating white resentment. And you explore how perhaps it's not up to Black people to save the democracy as a whole, and to often put their grief on the line as a way of trying to save the democracy, whatever the redemptive possibilities of that may or may not be. And there's a lot of question around that. But what I'm trying to draw together is, should our institutions be really focused on this question of loss and saying, are there people in this society who are bearing far too much loss such that we need public policy and law to respond to that in some way? Because that's what makes you a democracy, is the equal sharing of loss at one particular, at one moment or another, each bearing it at some time or another.
So, okay, I'm going to say something that's probably going to get me in trouble because I'm not a legal scholar.
This is no, we'll take that. We'll take that.
But so it's not like I study the Supreme Court, assiduously. But I think that one of the things that when you see the court sometimes grappling with these questions about how to do racial policy, that they often, I think, one of the things that they often do, I think, is not pay sufficient attention, right, to history, to the ways in which the moment in which we find ourselves is shaped by histories of loss, exclusion, right, stratification, inequality, and so there's this sense, right, and this is a common thread in kind of procedural accounts of justice, which is that justice is treating everyone the same. So if you deviate from that, that's unfair. But of course, the problem is not everybody's starting from the same place. So if your argument, right, if your starting point is the assumption, that you can't really grapple with the history of racial inequality in this country, or that, recognizing that there has been that history, and that therefore some of the steps that are being taken are a response to that, even though they might seem to be taking race into account, it's in fact, right, having a kind of blinkered view of the past, as if race wasn't being taken into account or hadn't been taken into account throughout, which is what got us to this moment. So I think there is a really interesting, question there about, the limits, of the law, or how is it that the law can, how can you bring those histories of racial inequality, of racial distinction, into legal reasoning without departing from this, this kind of, as if race, a kind of race neutral standard has been the baseline always, and this is where we should start.
Yeah. Well, you don't have to talk about the limits of law to me or this audience. We certainly experience it all the time. And I think one of the ways that we at Alliance for Justice have been trying to think about that has actually been about personnel as being policy, back to those earlier questions of inclusion and representativeness and sharing, that we need more people who have the background knowledge that you're describing and have fought for those issues. So they're bringing those experiences both as litigators and as human beings to the court. I'm going to ask one more question and go to the audience. I didn't realize how long we had gone, but this is kind of a capstone. So this book emerged from the 2014 Ferguson protests, and it's hard to believe that we're basically a decade removed from those protests now. Time has flown. And I'm curious, having written this book and probably thinking about those protests all along, and maybe even now as we reach this kind of anniversary, how would you assess the legacy of Ferguson on American democracy and Black politics? Are there continuing resonances that you see? And is there anything that dissipated that seemed promised then? I know a lot of us now are thinking about George Floyd and how there was this explosion of activism, the largest protest ever in American history. Countless corporate dollars flowing into nonprofits, not ours, but others. Not ours, but others. So I wanted to reflect on Ferguson. I mean, we're a decade
Yeah.
out. That seems an appropriate time, and it motivated the production of really wonderful work.
Yeah, we wouldn't have had the Floyd during 2020 Breonna Taylor protests if it hasn't been for Ferguson. I mean, I think that when we look at the last, the last decade, there has been a really re-energized, Black protest movement that we haven't seen since the 1960s, right? That there had been, I think, a real shift into sort of folks working through elected office. Of course, there were always activists and people working in other areas, but I think the kind of mass protest that we've seen over the past decade, I think, and the vision that emerged. I think one of the things that people often say, right, is or sometimes will say, is that the protest fails because we still have police violence and nothing has changed. And I don't think that's true. I think one of the things that emerged from the movement for Black Lives was a vision of a state that could function differently, right? Of a U.S. democracy that could function differently. That instead of focusing on policing, on punishment, on sort of carceral right approaches, that would invest in communities, that would allow, that would think about how to make it possible for people to thrive. And I think that vision is a vision that we see in the movement for Black Lives. I mean, the whole critique of economic inequality that comes out of Occupy Wall Street, another movement that people also said failed, that I think has made discussions about, the huge inequality in the United States now possible, that there's a way in which one of the things that social movements, protest movements do is that they change. This is an argument from my colleague Diva Woodley, that they change your collective political imagination, that we learn to see things that we didn't see before. And so I think, yes, it's absolutely true that police violence is still an issue, and we may not be seeing huge protests out on the street. But I think the fact that folks are rethinking what policing should look like, that they're rethinking how the criminal justice system should function, right? That their progressive DAs who are rethinking things like, like cash bail, that are rethinking, sentencing, that are rethinking charging, that there has been change. And I think it's also, when you think about the pandemic and the way in which the response in some ways was to try to find ways to take care of people, right? So how can we get people through this global crisis? That there is a sense that there is a different vision of a state that can and should invest in its citizens and take care of them, rather than, I'm old enough to remember, the kind of legacy of the Reagan era, when it was like, no, right, the state can't do anything, people should be doing things for themselves. And I think those changes in how we imagine what we want, right, what we want the state to do, what we want our relationship to be, I think that is something that that certainly the movement for Black Lives has played a big role in making that transformation possible.
For sure. Yeah, I definitely think there are absolutely new political imaginaries that did not exist prior to the Ferguson protests and the Black Lives Matters movement. Let me turn quickly to some of the questions that we have. We only have just a few minutes, but Juliana Gonin, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly, but she's asked, apologists for the insurrectionists have engaged in whataboutism and point to the BLM protests as though they are the same. What do you think of as being some of the best arguments against the right's narrative of false equivalence between racial justice protests and January 6th? And you have a whole chapter on riots inside of the book that actually I think could be co-opted by the right in terms of some of its justifications. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Absolutely. So, I think the social science analyses that have been done have shown that, far and wide, the Black Lives Matter protests were overwhelmingly peaceful, and that when there was actually violence, it was often instigated by the police, and by over policing of those protests. But I think that the fact of the matter is that there is a stark difference between how those protests were approached versus how January 6th was approached, right? So there is obviously a sense, a disparity, I think, and this is where we should start, between how the expression of, let's say, Black and white anger is perceived, right? So Black protests are immediately assumed to be angry and radical and prone to violence, and I think often white protesters, even when they are being violent, aren't responded to in that way. And so we see this in the sort of whitewashing of the January 6th insurrection, which was violent. And I quote this line from Ron Johnson, the senator from Wisconsin, in the book, where he says, I knew the January 6th insurrectionists to be, they were good people and law abiding. But, if it had been Black Lives Matter or Antifa protesters, I would have been concerned. Mm-hmm. And I think part of what we see here is that even when, because of our stereotypes about who's prone to violence and who is a threat and who is not, that even when Black people engage in peaceful protests, they're not received as such. And the best example of this are the athlete protests, right? Where the most peaceful thing you could do, which would be to kneel, was still criticized or seen as, offensive and problematic. So I think part of the problem is that Black protests, even when they're peaceful, are often interpreted as violent, and that we have, because of our propensity, let's say, to see white anger as normal and Black anger as dangerous, that even when you have violent white protests, they are often whitewashed and not seen for what they are.
Mm-hmm. We're running out of time, so maybe I'll just close us off and give you the last word. Thank you for writing this. It's been a long time since I've read a book where I felt like so much was said and yet so much was left still to be said. It struck me as an immediate intervention in a conversation that we need to be having and that we need to keep having. There's a line that I thought we should end with, because unfortunately, not unfortunately, but the way the conversation has gone, we haven't really focused enough on the Black grief part of it. And that's why maybe the conversation felt so incomplete. I had this feeling of like, I want more, we're not done, is because it's not often the case that we talk about the extent of Black grief. You were reminding me, actually, in the midst of the book, I had this instant memory come up of a opera I went to attend. It was a Black opera performed by Black actors. I don't know if that's a Black opera or just an opera, but anyway, point to the point. There was a woman there was a death scene, and a woman was crying out at a Black funeral. And it was so moving to me. And I realized that Black funerals, almost like Black church, tend to be very isolated affairs, that they are probably one of the most segregated spaces in our society, just like Malcolm X talked about, Black churches and high noon on Sunday. And that, therefore, is rendered invisible in our democracy, the extent to which Black grief is constantly being processed, constantly being worked through and worked over, and that often that Black grief is only seen publicly, as in the Emmett Till situation or the George Floyd situation, when it's being mobilized for some kind of democratic renewal. And so there's a point you make where you say, to put it starkly, 9 innocent Black citizens, those were the citizens of the Charleston massacre, had to die to enable peaceful white acquiescence to an instance of symbolic loss that was taking the flag off of the Capitol, the Confederate flag off of the Capitol. So I just want to end maybe briefly. I think we have about 60 seconds. Is this a pessimistic book, a hopeful book, just a matter of fact book, or how do you see it?
I see it as a matter of fact book. I think I'm telling some uncomfortable truths that we all know, but perhaps don't want to confront directly. And I think the issue isn't, I don't like this framing of hope versus despair, because I think your point is well taken. Black loss is unremitting. It continues, right? People are suffering as we speak, either police violence, all of the other ways that we know this goes on. And so the issue is not how to hold on to hope, or how not to give into despair. But I think I want to turn that question around and say, what can we all do to make this the democracy that we want to have, or the political community that we want to have, rather than always focusing on the way in which Black people are or aren't trying to make sense of the conditions in which they find themselves.
Well, thank you, Professor Hooker, for this illuminating conversation. Thank you for writing this book. As I noted, it started in the Ferguson protests, so it took many, many years, and we're grateful for your dedication to your craft. I want to thank everyone for tuning in. Be sure to follow the Alliance for Justice on social media to stay up to date on future events. And please do follow Professor Hooker on social media at Creole Prof on Twitter. We still call it Twitter. We don't call it X. You can also visit afj.org for more information on our organization and to sign up for our newsletters. With that, sorry for taking you a minute over, but I hope you enjoyed this very rich conversation. And thank you again to Professor Hooker for participating.
Thanks for having me.